inside everything.
All right, we're back with another episode of The Strategy Inside Everything. I feel like every episode I say this one's been a long time coming, but our guest today is Rachel Mercer, who is the Executive Strategy Director at RGA. And this one really has been months and months. I think we met in June, in the summer.
Yeah, I think it was right after I just started. So I was still like, I didn't even know where the conference rooms were, let alone where we were supposed to meet.
Yeah, that's funny. You were brand spanking new. But this one is actually, I think I had even reached out to you before that. So this was even longer time coming. But Rachel, thank you so much for joining.
No, thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really excited that we were able to make this happen.
No, thanks again. So you are currently at RGA. Would you give people a snippet of your background and how you got to the place that you're currently working, because that's germane to our topic for today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I've given this potted history a little bit before, but I originally came up as a designer in this business. So I'm sort of much more classically trained in graphic design. It was because when I saw ads, I thought the only definition of what an ad was what I saw at a bus or a subway station. So I was like, I want to do that, or I would like to design album covers or any of those sorts of things. So I had sort of a hodgepodge of jobs early on, working at an architecture firm, designing things like carpet patterns and wayfinding for things like Disney Dream Cruises. I worked at a couple of sort of local advertising agencies. I grew up in Texas, so all the great things about that. But always really dreamed of working at a big agency. And at the time, I was reading quite a lot about, Alex Bogusky and the 9-inch diet and things like that. And I was like, man, this is a guy who's, on the cover of Fast Company or Forbes. I don't even remember what it was at the time. And I was like, this guy's changing the business. And so I got my very first sort of what I would call, I guess, big ad gig at Crispin, very much working as a UX designer, worked on the team that did, part of the Domino's Pizza Tracker and those sorts of things, and helped do products and services there. And they were very much at the forefront. They were the ones who helped create things like Small Business Saturday and Amex Open Forum. So they had like a fully built out tech team at a very early stage. And then, I got very excited by the prospect of potentially working for this guy named Bud Cadell. I'd been one of those people who's always just incredibly enthusiastic about the internet. So I'll find and follow people very deeply for a number of years. And so when I did a call with Deutsch, I honestly hadn't really heard of them, but I had heard of Bud, and a couple of my former Crispin bosses were sort of over there designing a new thing. And I was really excited about the idea or the notion of invention, because, I loved the internet. I always felt like, there was so much potential in how it could change our relationships with different businesses. And I think we've sort of start to see that come to fruition now. So while I was there, I sort of worked in this weird hybrid role that was half teach creatives and our clients what the internet is and how it works and how can we make every project just a little bit more digital. And then the other half was very creating sort of products or services or different ideas from scratch, and got to work across a great array of clients, from Target to Taco Bell to insurance. So I loved the category, and Volkswagen, of course, was fun too. And so from there, what I was very sort of frustrated by, again, I'm sorry if this is too long of the history.
No, this is good. You were was it still in a UX role? Because that's what you were doing at Crispin, or at this time, had you transitioned into some kind of a strategy role?
No, so it was very weird. So Bud had very carefully cultivated this group of what he liked to call misfit toys. So, so any one of us, we were supposed to be sort of a digital SWAT team. So, one of us was much more strategy oriented. I sort of brought like a design and creative technology background to it. There were two other members of the team who were also either very creative and tech heavy or tech and UX heavy. So together, the four of us were essentially supposed to be able to, if we wanted to prototype and build a thing, in theory, like make that happen as quickly as possible for our clients. And we very much started bringing things like the agile and the sprint model to the agency world. So we were very much like, oh yeah, we can absolutely crack a brief in 2 weeks because, it doesn't take that much time. And we can put something in the hands of our clients. And it was while I was there that I think I very much started to realize that, where does work actually come from? It tended to come from briefs. Like they were the ones originating, the direction that the rest of us were going in. And I was very excited sort of about that process and very much decided that I wanted to be a strategist. And so I think I've told this story before, but I actually asked Bud, I was like, can you train me in digital strategy? I would really like to be a strategist. And then what he did instead was made 140 slide deck and then put it on the internet for everyone else to do it. And I was like, I appreciate that, but I really wanted to selfishly have all of that for myself. So it was good because I still have something to refer back to when I want. And he made the internet a better place in the process.
I have benefited from that deck as well. So Thank you for asking. Thank you for asking for that.
Yeah, no, it was great. But at the time I was definitely like a bit of a petulant child about it. And so then I felt like we were trying to make lots of products and services, but weren't actually, again, Deutsch was very much a sort of transforming at the time into an integrated advertising agency. It had been very traditional and was moving to be much more digital, and as evidenced with things like Volkswagen.com and the work that ended up happening for Taco Bell. So I was looking abroad. I'd spoken to Tim Malbin a couple of years before, and a role sort of opened up at Made by Many. And again, it being the internet and me constantly being a bit of a fangirl of things, was immediately like emailing Tim being like, I just saw this opening, is there any possibility? And he said, yeah, absolutely. Like I loved it when we first met. And so I was very excited to go there and sort of, again, get trained up in a bit of a strategy role. And then immediately, because Made by Many is such a small shop.
How big is that shop? Because the work they do is big, so it's hard from the outside. I know it's not a huge shop, but it's hard to know how big is it, or how big was it then?
Yeah, so it was a transition for me because Deutsch at the time was something like 400 people, and Crispin also was quite large, and so going to 35 to 50 person shop, and we were sort of fluctuating at the time at Made by Many, was such a huge transition because suddenly you don't have your very specific swim lane anymore, right? You have to wear many hats and do a little bit of everything. So that was definitely a little bit of jumping off the deep end for me.
Yep. Do you thrive in that environment of wearing more than one hat, or do you, now that you've kind of found your role?
I mean,
do you like being focused in strategy, or do you still play in different areas?
I think that my time at Made by Many was such a foundational and touchstone moment for me because I think because of wearing those many hats, I have a much better business acumen. I understand sort of like the production side of things. I've had to write scopes of work. And I think that helps me be a better strategist, especially in my function now and a leadership function, because then I not only can help steer the work better, right? Because if you even think about me wanting to be upstream with strategy and guiding the work and setting the vision for what we do, in a lot of ways, at certain types of agencies, the account team sort of does that when we establish what our scope is with the clients. And so I definitely think that I now wear many more hats than just strategy. And I've sort of carried that through from my original role at Made by Many, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. What parts of the design background that you started with do you still kind of carry with you today as if you have a new project or a new problem to solve for a client? What tools do you notice that you keep using that you picked up during your earlier career as a designer? And then what I kind of want to do is walk through the career and see which parts of which jobs you still use.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think like one thing that you're taught, there's a couple of things that you get taught in school very early on that I think are just generally quite helpful. So the first is that a fundamental part of design school is always the critique. So you have to pin your work up on the board. It's been like, blood, sweat, and tears for a number of weeks to fulfill an assignment. And you basically have 30 of your peers tear down and nitpick any single thing that's up on the wall. And I think that was a really foundational and helpful thing for me to learn, because in this business, 90% of what you think of or come up with ends up sitting on sort of the cutting room floor. So I mean, that's much more of like a soft skill at the end of the day, but I think it did help me build quite a bit of resilience and tolerance for feedback and flexibility.
But I don't view it as a soft skill, because for the creative team, you're right. They get critiqued to within an inch of their life every project. But a lot of times the strategy is sort of unassailed. It gets written, it gets shared, with the strategy team maybe, or with a couple other key people, and then it gets presented. But it doesn't get obliterated the way creative does, where somebody could go through 4, 5, 6, 7 different iterations of an idea before, the account team even sees it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I feel like you're getting a far better end of the stick than I am, because I still feel like I go through a good 7 rounds, and maybe that's just me being my own worst critic at the end of the day too. But before we get to sort of a final approved strategy on my end.
Do you think that is? Do you think it's as the creative team at RGA and the strategy team has the same amount of critique on their individual work product?
Again, I don't know if I've sat enough with the RGA creative team, but I think there are similar levels of interrogation. They're just happening in different circles. So, we have what's called like a strat pack. So we have the strategist, a connections planner, and a marketing sciences person that tend to sit together. And so you naturally sort of have quite a lot of inputs at any given time. So even if a deck isn't like fully baked, you haven't come to me with your like mostly realized babies, and then I'm suddenly killing them. It's much more of like a many paper cuts process, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. So you benefit from it though, because you have processed how to take that critique to make the work better and not fall apart when people are, a connections planner is pointing out some media information that you hadn't had access to or just hadn't occurred to you to think about.
Yes, absolutely. And I think too, there's also like a constant state of being inspired or challenged by the people around you. And I think it helped, I think, keep me a little bit more open-minded, not just around that feedback, but sort of like wide-eyed about what everyone else was doing as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. Yeah. What do you, are there areas that you have younger strategy people explore from the design side of things, things you learned from design that you still try to teach as you're training younger staff?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of principles that I'm starting to bring through. So one thing that you get taught very early on in design that seems quite basic for a strategist is quite a bit of empathy. It's empathy and also hierarchy. So for example, when you're thinking about, again, I'll use a print design component, but we would have to design bus ads, and it would there's such a thing as like a 20-foot view and a 5-foot view, and you have to think about how you convey that information in both a 20-foot view and a 5-foot view. And when you think about something like a brand or a messaging hierarchy or those sorts of things, it's very much falling into those similar principles, but that you're also putting yourself sort of constantly in the shoes of the viewer and thinking about how they're experiencing it, how they're taking in all of those things. And I think constantly reminding ourselves of who those human beings are and how they're going to be consuming what you're putting in front of them, which I think a designer ends up doing a lot more deliberately at the end of the day, is sort of one of them. And I think too, is also like a very specific approach to storytelling. So I think Ellen Lupton, who's written some great books on, thinking with type and other things, also recently just published a book called Design is Storytelling. And, some of it comes through in that like hierarchy of messaging and those sorts of things. But also you have to think about when you have that moment or that impression, how are you bringing that individual along the journey with you? And I think as strategists, that's also really important because, we are at the very beginning of that process, right? We're supposed to have, again, that vision, our understanding for the brand and set that mission and the plan for how to get there. But then we need to bring all of the troops along with us. And if we fail to do that, then we're all just sort of like marching in a direction relatively aimlessly, or we end up having like a little bit of a Cassandra complex where we tell everyone that Troy is going to burn down, but nobody listens to us. And then we all sort of burn in a fiery demise, to use my, best metaphors possible.
That was a really unexpected metaphor. I salute you for that.
Thanks. I try.
Now, the way you just explain those things, they seem 100% intuitive and part of a toolkit that makes a lot of sense to me. Do the young strategists that you introduce that to, have they heard that before, or are they scratching their head and saying, what does that have to do with this?
I definitely think so. One of the things that my team tends to tease me a little bit about is I have a tendency to give drawn feedback rather than written feedback. And this is where it starts to become a bit more concrete for them, because I'll be explaining for them as I'm drawing out, how a deck should flow or how we're going to bring someone on that journey with us. Like, did you see how I've taken you through every single step of this story in a very deliberate way? And by drawing it by hand, and making it also the simplest and easiest thing to follow. And I think what happens to us, and this is just a far more natural inclination of anyone who sort of grew up on the internet, is we go straight into our slides or straight into a briefing document or a briefing template, and we haven't necessarily thought through exactly what we want to do. So they're starting to pick up on it a bit more, and I think they've been much more excited about it. But it's only recently that I feel like I've started to see and understand the value of my design training, because for a while I've mostly felt self-conscious that I wasn't enough of a strategist.
Oh, welcome. Yeah, I think that's how we all feel.
Exactly. All of us Americans who didn't get the great grad schemes that happen in the UK.
That's amazing. Well, that leads me actually to your idea about drawing things out. How much do you actually put pen to paper when you are introduced to a problem? Mm-hmm. Do you start by sketching relationships and drawing it all out in ink and paper or pencil and paper before any words go down, or take me through kind of what your process is and what I'm interested in is how much it really does relate to wireframing, or how much it really relates to creating a user flow where you're funneling people from one step to the next.
Right. Well, so again, to go back to design school a little bit, one of the things that you're always encouraged to do is what they call gesture drawings, or even if you're doing logo designs or if you're doing wireframes, you start out with those sketch prototypes. And it's so that you can quickly go through a bunch of ideas or a bunch of exercises, and then you'll eventually, after you do like 30 or 40 or 50, feel like you have one or two that are really starting to stand out for you. And at very early stages in your design career, it ends up being like a bit of a volume game, because you have to really push yourself through the obvious ideas to get to the ones that feel more exciting. And then eventually, you can be Paula Scher and draw the Citibank logo on a napkin at a bar. But so what I tend to do is, as I'm listening to, there's a couple of different ways that this manifests. So if I'm in a client meeting and they're describing to me what their sort of problems are, I'm using a drawing typically to help me visualize all of the different sort of factors at work, especially sort of in that system. So like, for example, one client that we have, bombards their core customer to death with cross-sell messages. So I'm very quickly, trying to see and understand, what's the volume of each of these things and how is it impacting the core. But like another maybe more tangible example is, whenever I write out a deck, I don't even go into slides. I tend to go straight into like white index cards, and I'll write out or draw out sort of the effect or the point that I want every key slide to make, and I'll lay them out all out on the table. And then I can move things around or add or subtract them. But then I also have a thing that I can go to people with and sort of test out if the story is working. Because again, if you're not following my story, or if you're not on board with it, then it's all a little bit for naught. So I think that helps me get a much clearer sort of frame of thinking before we get into all the notions or all of the details, or what this type looks like on a screen, or how big should it be on the slide, or anything like that.
Right. That's not as important. How much sketching and then do you have to do before you can get to? You said if you were doing it in design with logos, you do 50 to get to 2 that are special. How much sketching do you have to do in strategy before you get to a place where you feel that it's special or in the right area, or something that you can go to the deck and start building out slides? Is it still a volume game for you, or do you shape it from the cards?
I mean, sometimes too, I don't think it's as much of a volume game, but probably because I have to produce a lot more than I used to. Like part of why I couldn't handle design was that there's also then a lot of the detail work required after you've arrived at your concept. Like, how can I refine it into like a really shiny gem? And I'm very bad. I'm very bad at I don't have the patience for the refinement process. I didn't really have, I feel like, the craft skills. But so for me, I tend to have a much quicker, like, draft to in a deck sort of phase. So even, talking about the event that I was at yesterday, I think I was in a meeting and I had to, I wrote out my first 15 slides. I turned them all into a deck, and then I sort of rejiggered it once I was in there. But that was all maybe like an hour and a half in total.
I find I'm always tweaking the deck up until the last second. I mean, until the thing goes up and we're presenting it, I'll keep on reorganizing it and tweaking it and taking out slides and moving them back and editing it right up to the last second.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I'm always like a little bit of a worrier. I'm always kind of trying to refine it up to that last second, because there's always like one slight way to do it a little bit better.
I've noticed that if I don't feel somewhat nervous or worried that I'm about to get pantsed, I've just figured out that if I don't go in there feeling a little bit uncomfortable, then it's probably not ready yet. First, I know that might not even make sense, but the first draft, I always feel like, oh, that's great. And then, I take a day off of it, and then I think about it more and I say, oh, no, that's not even, that's terrible. I have to start over and redo that entire thing.
Yeah, I think I was talking to Camilla Gray, who's a strategist in London, about this before, but we both can worry quite a lot over the quality of the product, but and then someone will say, oh, it's great, don't worry quite so much. But there's some point in time where you're like, actually, the worrying is what makes it good. So I don't really know. I don't really know when I'm gonna not worry.
Yeah, I've stopped fighting it. I'm comfortable with the worrying.
Yeah. I've accepted it for sure.
That's the drive. That's what makes me check it again. And because you're dead on with the index cards. If I present them out of order and the person I'm telling the story to doesn't follow, we're dead. And everything that's going to come after is also dead.
Right. Well, and again, it goes back a little bit to that 20-foot view and that 5-foot view, right? When we're reviewing a deck on a screen, we're viewing it one slide at a time. So you're expecting that everybody else sort of behind you or with you as they're reviewing it has the whole and complete story held in their head in the same way. And so actually understanding if you're hitting all the beats or if you've covered all the context that you need to cover is kind of hard if you don't also have that, again, that like 20-foot view.
That's a great example. Yeah. My favorite feeling, tell me if you can identify with this. My favorite feeling is when we've worked hard on a presentation, we sit down with a client or sometimes, doing a talk or something, and somebody asks a question about what's about to be revealed on the next slide. I'm always like, I set it up perfectly. Nailed it.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely one of the favorite, because it means that, again, to get back to the user empathy or putting yourself in the user's shoes, it means that you have absolutely sort of anticipated what they want to know in that process. So that's always great.
And let's talk about levels. Let's talk about multiple levels of thought and multiple levels of problem solving, because you're creating content to be consumed by someone in the agency or someone at the brand. But and so we have to have empathy for them. But on a greater scale, on a greater level, there's users or customers or consumers or people that are going to be in the tens, dozens, thousands, millions that have to consume the end result of this. So sometimes balancing those things to present ideas that are relevant to that end consumer of the final information versus the person in the room who's the initial recipient. How have you found challenges balancing that? Because as a designer, that can be a challenge where you're not the audience for this.
Yeah, I think it's one of the hardest things about our business. And again, I also think that Martin, I don't know how to say his last name, Martin Weigel posted a really great talk about this recently, right? About, viewing people in focus groups is like viewing dolphins in captivity. It's not necessarily the same thing. And what happens with us is we get so caught up in all of our jargon, back and forth, is that we forget that these customers or these people are just human beings, like scrolling through their feed. It's sort of stuck between like a dog photo and like the latest shitty piece of news. And like, how are we going to at all stand out in that sort of category? So I do think that, again, sort of being a designer and also one that had to work at an architecture firm, when you think about things like wayfinding and how does somebody find their way through an area or a space, or then eventually as a UX designer through a system, it really helps me clarify that thinking and tell, again, much simpler messages or stories at any given time. It helps me simplify more than anything else, which I think in our business can be one of the harder things to do.
Well, it's the world is spinning more and more wildly out of control, and we're still trying to hold it all together for people's attention. When you're right, if I'm creating an ad, I have to compete with that dog photo. I have to compete with, their boyfriend posting something. I have to compete with news from their kid's school. Who the hell knows what the president just said? And now it's like, and also care about this new headlights on the brand new Jeep Wrangler. Like, it's really hard to keep all those things in check.
Yeah, and it's definitely one of the things that I am sort of constantly pushing either our clients or ourselves for, which is, and it always breaks them out just for a moment where they remember, where I'm like, yes, you guys absolutely do this most amazing, education program or corporate social responsibility campaign. But like, as we're talking about like kids in cages, how can we stand out a little bit more, or have like a more meaningful thing to say than just like, oh, look what a good job I'm doing, sort of in this process at any given time. And it does help our clients like wake up for a moment to realize the sort of space they're in.
Yeah, and they live in that brand world, that company world. So it is important to get them to snap out of it. But you triggered a question for me, going back to design, and you've referenced print a couple times and out of home. Those things are 2D. They're constrained. A bus side is a really good example of something that's on a traveling piece of sheet metal that is driving through town, and you cannot control the context around it. Digital stuff, when we think about brand safety on YouTube, or, what the context that I'm going to see this programmatically purchased banner ad next to some terrible piece of news or some video from an extremist group or God knows what. That's one thing on the creative side. How does strategy is never static either. I mean, it's a snapshot of a moment in time, but how do you handle presenting potential? This could happen or this could happen, and this is how we've accounted for those potential outcomes.
I wish I could talk about a specific client example right now, because we have a couple of really relevant ones, but I just don't know. I'm trying to think if I can actually. I don't know if I should.
Don't get in trouble.
Yeah. I don't want to get in any trouble. But I think, one of the nice things that we have, at least at RGA, which is like, to me, such an amazing thing, because we have a big like marketing sciences group. We have access to all of these incredible tools. So it's usually reasonably easy to paint a picture of what that potential is using some sort of historical data. So if we go out with this sort of message in this sort of place, here's like 3 ways that other brands have performed in that relative category. And I think, clients too tend to forget a little bit that like standing for something means standing against something, or having a message that's meaningful often means you have to actually say something rather than just go straight down the middle. And so accepting that there's going to be some tension in any sort of good breakout messaging is important.
How do we better prepare brands to understand that? I don't feel like there's a lot of surprise when those things happen, when something dynamic changes out in the marketplace, or we partner with a content producer and they do something, or there's a story next to your ad or next to your piece of content. How can we work better to prepare them? Where I feel like in design and creative side, we do a much better job of saying, okay, now if we choose this path, we're kind of locked in this way. Do you have do you have that challenge in strategy?
I mean, I don't know if and maybe this is just my circumstance right now, but I don't know if we have as much either patience or opportunity in order to make that happen, because a lot of the job of strategy is to sort of, again, set what you think that path should be as clearly and directly and as focused as possible. So I think when, sometimes with clients, they don't really want to see what all the potential paths are at the end of the day, because sometimes they just want they just want the answer. And again, that could just be my very.
But do you map the alternative paths out for yourself as a thought experiment?
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to more design frameworks, but I tend to be I think I very naturally follow like a double diamond approach, sort of as I think about things. So, go on a very broad discovery path, narrow it down to a few, areas of opportunity, and then go back out again with the creative process or ideas. And, even in a brief where you would normally think that the brief is at the intersect of those to diamonds, it actually ends up falling a little bit into the ideation as well. Because again, having sort of come up at Crispin, a good brief also has a little bit of the creative idea baked into it as well. But yeah, I feel like I trailed off actually on that on that one. I got very excited, and then I forgot what your original question was.
Well, I was asking if you map out multiple paths, but it sounds like you start with a really broad exploration and you zero in on a single path over time as you're researching or thinking through it.
Yeah, I definitely still have there are sort of ignored paths in the back of my mind with a strategy. But again, I feel like I have to be very I'm much more comfortable with letting those go as we go on, because again, it's at the cutting room floor, so I tend to leave them quite alone.
You can't play the what if game on every single project.
Yeah.
When you were a designer, were you one of those people that would do, not pre-digital, when you were designing print and carpet patterns and things, were you one of those designers that was doing hardcore customer research to figure out what world they lived in and create, personas, either formalized or informal, to really understand what would make them react? Or were you more technically designing and, just following process to get to the best solutions you could think of?
No, I think there's a very, it's funny because I think there's a lot of things that I did that were a little bit naturally strategy. So like four C's, so I would go out and I'd see what everyone else is doing in the category, because you often don't want to, create a color scheme or a pattern necessarily based on anyone else, or you want to stand against it. So there was, one time I think we tried to make an argument for making the Band-Aid box red because everything in that category is blue or something like that. But so that ends up being one part of it, but two, definitely a lot of user research, trying to put in your mind exactly where that person's being. I think, in wayfinding, you actually kind of have to sketch out how that person is moving through that space, so you're able to have that much more sort of clarified.
Which area do you think is most in need of empathy? I think wayfinding is a place where I always, when I'm lost, I feel like these people had no fucking idea what I was going to be looking for when I was standing at this intersection here.
Yeah, I feel like wayfinding was definitely the one that had to be the most precise and the most thought through. I think, in any part of design, like in advertising, it's very easy to be lazy in certain components. So it's easy to think about a logo and design a logo on its own, but thinking about it as part of a larger design system. So how does that carry over into business cards or headers or the website or those sorts of things, required quite a bit of systems thinking and some user empathy too, because you need to think about where the most important place is to a person that this is going to be showing up to make an impression. Again, I don't think they taught that necessarily as much in school. It was much more, the quality of the mark, how scalable it was, those sorts of things. But definitely some of those foundational elements.
When you talk to people that you worked with as a designer, are they surprised that you're in strategy? I have a feeling not.
I honestly, I don't talk to enough people that I went to school with, but I do think a lot of them did end up naturally transitioning into much more of a UX field than, let's say, a branding field. So a lot of them now are product designers and UX designers and things like that. And I think, that's quite a natural extension. And you do end up doing, especially if you work on product side or brand side on any of these things, you end up doing a lot of the strategy components yourselves too, because we're the only crazy fuckers who have strategy as a title, in advertising agencies, or maybe like the McKinsey folks every so often. But at Google, there's no such thing as a
Right.
strategist. There's a UX researcher and a product designer on the team, and maybe a program manager. But between the three of them, they're owning the strategy for what that ends up being.
I mean,
so no, I don't. Oh, I was just going to say, I don't think anyone's really surprised, but I do think it's been also the natural evolution of the business.
Yeah, when you said UX and product managers, seeing the shape of strategy today, that's just kind of where people went. A lot of people that were copywriters are now content strategists, and then the designers move towards product and UX. How much do you care if someone's title is strategist or has some version of strategy in their title? We have agencies have been kind of adding strategy talent and strategy titles across the board, and I just came from a talk where somebody was explaining that there should be 1 in 6 people in an agency are strategists, and I was thinking, like, do you really need 1 in 6 people to have the title of strategist, or do you just want everyone to be thinking strategically and getting to the same outputs?
I mean, I think that I would much rather the latter, right? Because like every great creative, I think, is very much a natural strategist at the end of the day too, because they're coming to their own, raw insights that makes that creative work sing. I think, some of the best account people that I've ever met are very like natural strategists too, because they sort of see and plan how everything is going together. So, and again, like, it's easy for me to not be precious about it because I'm not like a classically trained British planner. So like to me, like I've decided to call myself a strategist, and that's what I've sort of become in the process. But I'm not. So I'm not that precious about it. But I'm sure there's people out there who might be a bit more.
That's true. I guess if you were born and raised on the discipline of account planning or brand strategy from the other side of the pond, yeah, there's a different perspective on it then. Maybe I'll have to find someone and have them on, have someone from the UK on the show to correct me on that.
Yeah. Well, but all of that being said, I don't think that anyone can necessarily just be a strategist out of sheer will. There are some characteristics that are common and shared between all strategists, right? There's a sort of constant curiosity that absolutely can't be taught at all. And I think an interest, and again, that sort of like empathy to being open to other things. Like, yes, you can be a very good strategist about the music business if you love music and you know it like the back of your hand, but there's a certain, like, again, flexibility and empathy that helps put me in the shoes of a Midwestern millennial evangelical mom just as much as, a 50-year-old dude who's just bought a car, as much as like a Gen Z teenager, and being able to put myself in those shoes. I think, again, it's a difficult thing to sort of teach. It's almost inherently
it's binary. You can do it or not. You can get better at it if you can do it a little bit, but if you can't do it, it's a hard thing to learn. Yeah,
absolutely.
All right. Well, Rachel, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for making time. We got started a little bit late, and I don't want to keep you. So thank you very much. Where can people find you? What do you have? Where are you online, and what do you have coming up?
Oh my gosh. You can find first off, thank you so much for having me on. It's always a supreme pleasure to get to chat. But if you're looking for me on the internet, I'm pretty much at Rachel Mercer on every single platform. Right now, I'm working with the RGA team to develop a bit of a craft syllabus for strategy, and help us be sort of the next school of thought, or sort of like training ground for creating connected brands. So hopefully you'll see that out in the next few months.
I love that. That's awesome. If I could get a sneak peek of that, I would love it.
Yeah, will do.
All right. I love it. Thank you again. I really appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks so much, Adam.